My name is Ella Layton, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to recognize that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We hereby recognize the prior status and the enduring diversity of this land and the many indigenous nations that stand in relation to it, particularly the thousands of indigenous children from dozens of tribes forced into the reprogramming camp established at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879. Dickinson College supported this agenda of cultural eradication in both word and deed. Turning honestly towards that shameful past animates this acknowledgement and gives orientation to our desire for a reconciled future. Accordingly, this living land acknowledgement is intentionally incomplete, a reflection of the ongoing process it represents. To learn respectfully from the stories of this land and the peoples that carry them, to think reflectively about the injustice in our shared past, and to act responsibly with that knowledge today to inspire a more equitable tomorrow. On behalf of the Clark Forum, I would like to invite you to tonight's Winfield C. Cook Constitution Day conversation, picturing the Constitution, curators, artists, and scholars in conversation. The annual Winfield C. Cook Constitution Day program is endowed through the generosity of Winfield C. Cook, former Dickinson trustee. Each year, the Clark Forum invites prominent public figures to campus to speak on a contemporary issue related to the Constitution. The event celebrates the signing of the United States Constitution September 17, 1787, and commemorates Dickinson's connection to that document through John Dickinson's participation as an original signer. And for this reason, I'm excited to introduce tonight's panelists to speak on their interpretations and reflections of the United States Constitution. Katherine Gressel currently serves as the contemporary curator at the Old Stone House in Washington Park, where she oversees artists and guest curators. She specializes in site-specific and participatory art in non-traditional spaces. In addition to organizing over a dozen major exhibitions at Old Stone House, Gressel has curated and produced artist projects for the Art Gonus, Smack Mellon, St. Francis College, and Brooklyn Historical Society. Since 2024, Gressel has been a member of the Mother Creatrix Collective, organizing exhibitions focused on the intersections of art and caregiving. She was the 2016 NARS Foundation Emerging Curator and an Independent Curators International 2015 Curatorial Intensive participant. Bang Geul Han is an interdisciplinary artist who works in video, performance, code, and weaving. Her art has been displayed at venues such as Air Gallery, the Bronx Museum, Queens Museum, and the Shelley and Donald Rubin Foundation, among many others. She has been awarded many artist residencies, including being a 2024 Guggenheim Fellow, MacDowell Fellowship, and Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Han also serves as an associate professor at City University of New York at Staten Island. Steven Mazie is a professor of political studies at Bard High School, Early College, Manhattan, and the Supreme Court correspondent for The Economist. Mazie's publications include American Justice 2015, The Dramatic 10th Term of the Roberts Court, and Israel's Higher Law, Religion and Liberal Democracy in the Jewish State. He has also published op-eds in the New York Times, The Washington Post, the Boston Globe, SCOTUS Blog, Slate, Time Magazine, and The Atlantic. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the panel, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the panelists, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our panelists and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other devices. In the event of emergency, accessible exits are located on the west side of the building behind me and the projector. And now, please join me in welcoming our panelists, Katherine Gressel, Bang Geul Han, and Steven Mazie.
Hi, and thank you for I'll move this over. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm also so glad that Bang Geul and Steven could join us as well to provide a closer look at some of the artwork and the Constitution itself. Before handing it over to them, I'll present kind of a brief overview of my exhibition to kick off a larger conversation about the role artists can play in helping us engage with the Constitution, especially at a time when this feels more critical than ever. I'll be presenting examples of what I see as artists' unique ability to analyze and represent these texts and concepts in fresh new ways, promote creative forms of participation, and ultimately, I hope, help contribute to a more functional democracy. The exhibition builds on a rich tradition of artists' involvement with American politics since the nation's founding, including ongoing struggles for social justice. In the Q&A section, I'm happy to talk a little more about the exhibits that inspired this one, my past and current curatorial work on related topics, and more recent related exhibits and projects. So Picturing the Constitution was inspired partly by the historic shifts in our presidency and Supreme Court over the past decade, including recent court decisions that have brought the Constitution under new scrutiny. I wanted to invite artists to examine the Constitution's origins, contents, and key interpretations over the years by the court and governing bodies, and ask questions like, how well do these founding documents still serve us today? What could we add or amend? And the show was inspired also by the exhibition space, the Old Stone House in Washington Park, which is a reconstructed Dutch colonial farmhouse located on the site of the Revolutionary War Battle of Brooklyn in what is now Park Slope, Brooklyn. The Old Stone House is also at the crossroads of ancient Lenape roads, and we acknowledge this land's original inhabitants. Our contemporary art program for the past 8 years has aimed to connect our revolutionary history to current environmental and social justice themes. So a show about the Constitution was a natural fit. The selection process for the show included inviting artists who I already knew had been working with the constitutional themes for a while as a core part of their practice, such as Bang Geul. But in order to get a diverse group of well-informed approaches to the theme, we put out a call for applications open to anyone that included links to read and learn about the Constitution. We held a virtual info session for prospective applicants that included presentations by Steven Mazie and American art historian Jennifer Wingate, among others, both of whom also served on our artist selection committee. This resulted in a group of 17 artists or artist teams working in a range of media and approaches, including work analyzing the actual documents and work that was more focused on their impact on American life, plus several projects focused on public engagement. These are just a few shots of the exhibit, which can also give an idea of how the work interacted with kind of our untraditional gallery space. A central theme behind all the work is the idea of the Constitution as inspirational and with ideals worth fighting for, yet incomplete and increasingly difficult to amend. After all, it is one of the world's shortest constitutions, and we selected many artists who chose to focus on what or who has been left out or is still open to interpretation, alongside artists focusing more on moments of social progress. Most of the artists also in the show also engage directly with specific texts, facilitating closer readings through isolating, combining, obfuscating, or illustrating keywords and passages. For example, this ongoing series of work by artist Diana Schmertz uses powerful images such as people lifting each other up to help us take a closer look at the legal texts that she laser cuts into her paintings. They all focus on the inclusive and empowering social agreements in US history, such as Title IX of the Education Acts of 1972, intended to protect students from discrimination based on gender. Reconstruction, on the right, contains texts from the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th through 15th Amendments, which together abolished slavery and established citizenship and voting rights, and in smaller texts, the 1896 SCOTUS case, Plessy v. Ferguson. So having that in the work acknowledges also how states still held back progress with separate but equal laws. Says Schmertz of her use of text, at first, most viewers tend to respond to the emotion in the paintings. Upon closer view, they start to see and read the text. By using text and emotional imagery, I invite viewers to take part in the conversation through whichever mode of communication they feel most comfortable. Bang Geul Han will speak more in depth about her unique approach to combining legal texts to emphasize how certain rights and decisions are inevitably intertwined. Her contribution to the show, Sam's Kitchen Towels, is part of her ongoing series Warp and Weft, in which she weaves shredded legal documents together. This particular piece features 2 majority opinions by Justice Samuel Alito, Branovich versus the Democratic National Committee from 2021, and Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization 2022, which weakened the protection of the Voting Rights Act and abolished the constitutional right to abortion, respectively. These works aim to, quote, create a physical manifestation of the intersectional aspects of reproductive rights. Multiple works in the exhibition, including this selection from Donna Basson's My Own Witness photography series, incorporate the phrase, "we the people," from the Constitution's preamble that emphasizes the fact that the Constitution should belong to us all and puts faces and personal stories behind abstract legal concepts. Shortly after the 2016 election, Basson invited portrait sitters from diverse communities to use pose, gesture, gaze, and props, such as the American flag, to represent their own experience with the democracy. In this particular portrait, Devin, a young Latino transgender man, expresses the importance of visibility and pride in his identity at a time when his rights feel under threat. Alongside Devin, we showed an accompanying video that included other portraits and audio interviews from the series. Together, they suggest the power and responsibility of citizens to, in the words of Basson, resist their own obliteration and insist on their full participation in democracy. Throughout the show, you'll notice that the more text-heavy work is interspersed with work like Basson's incorporating traditional patriotic or representational imagery that also asks such questions as, in the words of artist Manju Chandler, as artists, how do we create symbols that will inspire and enlighten while still acknowledging our nation's complicated past and more pressing future? Chandler's contribution to the show features a female eagle dressed in fancy garb and armor, but rather than hunting, she is caught napping, a metaphor for the potential power of women that has yet to be fully activated. Also a reminder that the Constitution did not grant women the right to vote until the 19th Amendment in 1920. These uterine armor bloomers by Winnie Vanderen similarly incorporate American flag and military imagery and allude to what she considers a more recent threat to women's rights. And this American flag made of repurposed menswear, stars representing the states with abortion bans post-Dobbs were made of a water-soluble substrate that it dissolved, leaving ghost stars, representing the idea of how easily our constitutional rights could be, quote, washed away, and if we don't fight for them. Andrew Ellis Johnson's narrative drawings aim to address gaps between the Constitution's ideals and for how people should participate and how they are practiced. In this case, alluding to a history of voter suppression efforts, such as gerrymandering, assigning certain districts fewer polling stations, or restricting early or absentee voting, resulting in what appears in this image as long lines and the erasure of certain voters. Michael James Friedman's Supreme Court portraits also question the limits of American representative democracy, with its institutions like the Senate and Electoral College that can arguably result in a Supreme Court that has tremendous influence but does not represent the majority. Each justice's height here is tied to the popular vote of the elected representatives that chose them. The artist uses a formula that compares each justice based on what percentage of the US population voted in favor of the president that appointed them and the number of senators who voted to confirm them. In the 2018 portrait on the left, for example, Stephen Breyer towers over the rest of the justices, since he was nominated by a President, Bill Clinton, that won the popular vote and was confirmed by a vote of 87-9 in the Senate. On the other hand, Brett Kavanaugh was nominated by President Donald Trump, who lost the popular vote and was confirmed in a very close Senate vote, so he appears much smaller. In addition, the states whose senators voted for Kavanaugh had smaller populations, representing only 44% of the US. In the 2023 painting, updated, completed after Ketanji Brown Jackson's appointment, the justices' heights have evened out more, implying the increasing polarization of the court and our nation in general, where it's rarer to see support from a majority of both parties. Many artists in the show draw from personal and communal histories to highlight specific populations historically excluded from constitutional protections, i.e. on the basis of race, gender, sexual identity, geography, or immigration status, because of things like constitutional compromises or omissions. We chose to include these two older performance stills by Dred Scott because of his decades-long career making work, often in public spaces, that calls attention to the roots of oppression in America's founding history that included the institution of slavery. Dred's name, that he calls himself, is derived from the 1857 Supreme Court Dred Scott decision that held that African Americans could not be citizens of the US. Scott's I Am Not a Man was an hour-long performance where the artist walked through Harlem bearing a historic but crucially altered I Am Not a Man protest sign, referencing, in the words of the artist, the negation that defines Black people's existence because of decisions like Dred Scott. The sign references the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers' strike, where the iconic I Am a Man sign originated. The public performance on the right referenced the 1963 civil rights struggle in Birmingham, Alabama, in which the government used high-pressure fire hose water jets against nonviolent protesters in an effort to maintain segregation and legalize discrimination. Both performances attest to the importance of these civil rights era protests and legislation, and similar to protests today, as well as to their limitations. Dennis Redmoon Darkeem, an artist of both Black and Indigenous descent, underscores and uplifts the often overlooked contributions of both of these communities in the nation's founding. Darkeem juxtaposes texts from writings of James Madison, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, with bold imagery that alludes to the hundreds of enslaved people on Madison's estate and the violent colonization of native lands, with the four colors representing the sacred medicine wheel symbol used by many Native American tribes. The Iroquois Confederacy's constitution, known as the Great Law of Peace, dating back to 1450, provided a framework for the US Constitution, including a model of federalism. The Iroquois influence even extends to the adoption of the bald eagle as a national symbol, and you'll notice the eagle included in this work as well. These Iroquois contributions were finally fully recognized by a 1988 Senate resolution, but I would argue are not widely known. So artworks like this can serve to fill in these gaps in our historical narrative. These two stereoscopic viewers by Alex Callender contain drawings and texts that allude to the 1901 Insular cases, a series of Supreme Court decisions that failed to give full constitutional protections to US territories acquired during the Spanish-American War that were not on a path to statehood, such as Puerto Rico. In the 19th to 20th centuries, these viewers were often a means to circulate tourist trading cards and make exotic, far-off places come to life. This work is another example of a unique way to draw viewers in to a complicated text and concept while questioning American imperialist motives in the context of the Constitution. In this last section, I'll highlight several artists in the show who facilitated creative ways for the public to reread, revise, or rewrite the Constitution through other participatory installations and public programs. Though we weren't able to do an actual workshop with this group, we commissioned an original zine by Intelligent Mischief, an organization focused on envisioning alternatives to our Constitution, mainly, quote, creating spaces where Black folks can collectively imagine and co-create beautiful futures. The zine directly speaks to some of the other work in the exhibit by asking key questions geared at how we might actually design a new Constitution for a multiracial, inclusive, utopian democracy. We also included several works by the artist Ileana Doble Hernandez, focused on the Second Amendment, including a mailbox and instructions for visitors to write to their local representatives with their thoughts on gun legislation, using postcards with this powerful image of the artist's own son holding a toy bullet making a peace sign. This project serves as an example of how artists can not only inspire, but provide direct tools to help with political participation. This Penumbra installation by artist Maureen Connor in collaboration with constitutional scholar Jason M. Leggett combined close textual analysis with direct action. The phrase penumbra, or a partial shadow between regions of complete shadow and complete illumination, refers to the rights that are not explicit but implied from other protected rights in the Constitution. For example, when the 1965 Griswold v. Connecticut decision allowed the right to contraception based on a supposed constitutional right to privacy, which would eventually also inform the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision. This layering of translucent images and texts here on window curtains serves as a visual representation of the concept of the penumbra, and again is an example of how artists can help us break down these dense texts. The texts here are from Dobbs and Roe, with a focus on the idea from Dobbs that abortion is not deeply rooted in our history and tradition. The texts overlap images that argue against this phrase by highlighting the artist's research on a millennial-long legacy of women using herbs for abortion, contraception, and fertility. Some of those herbs are pictured here, and as well as actual legal history of these practices in the US. This research and advocacy has also been the focus of Connor's ongoing project, How to Perform an Abortion, which works to expand reproductive rights through art and pedagogy. In a related workshop at the Old Stone House, Connor and Leggett engaged participants in discussing these themes, collaboratively creating their own texts made from fragments from various reproductive rights-related cases and other sources. So workshops like this, I believe, are not aimed at changing the Constitution or recent SCOTUS decisions, or of course providing medical advice, but can hopefully help people understand and process our current legal climate, brainstorm action steps, and importantly, find community. While some of the projects in the show, like Penumbra, did take a pretty clear stance on current issues, the last two I'm going to describe were meant to welcome people from all political walks, including folks who might not even consider themselves political. Maya Cherokee's Remedy for a Constitutional Crisis outdoor performance gave passersby in our park the opportunity to listen in on the Constitution being read in multiple languages in full, discuss it in small facilitated groups, and propose their own 28th amendments. Some of the visitors submitted amendments from past iterations of the project were on view in the gallery in the form of these cyanotype prints with a nearby station where people could write new amendments on index cards throughout the duration of the exhibit. This is my daughter's contribution to the project. And then finally, I want to close by highlighting the ongoing work of Morgan O'Hara, whose Handwriting the Constitution project was one of the main inspirations for the show. Begun in 2017 as a form of what she calls activism for introverts, it invites people from all walks of life to meet in public spaces to handwrite the United States Constitution or other documents written to protect human rights and freedoms. The art practice was created so that people will, quote, know their rights, deepen their understanding of laws created to protect these rights, and help resist negative thinking. Thousands of people have participated to date in 5 continents, with people writing their own constitutions around the world, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We were fortunate to be able to feature several works from Morgan's archive, including pages from one of her original handwritten constitutions, handwritten quotes from Abraham Lincoln and founding fathers, and photos of past participants. We also showed a documentary in the gallery, which we might get to see a clip of at the end of this presentation, if time permits, and we held our own handwriting workshop in the gallery as well. O'Hara continues to encourage people to hold their own handwriting sessions to, quote, create a physical and psychological space to bring people together in a quiet and calming way. And when you're calmer, your decision-making process is better, i.e., you're perhaps better equipped to participate in democracy. What I love about this project is you don't have to be a legal expert, a talented public speaker or activist, or even a trained artist to meaningfully engage. I'll end with a quote from my curatorial statement. Together, the artists in Picturing the Constitution emphasize the importance of this kind of deep engagement with the imperfect documents that have shaped our past and present, including imagining a more perfect future. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Bang Geul.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. My name is Bang Geul Han. I engage with text as a raw material, as an artist, kind of that imbued with, they're imbued with power and emotion by the author, but also the reader alike. I am interested in I look at text in a way, I regard it as extension of a body in some sense, and how the text connects to another body, and how it comes back to us. The first work that I want to share with you is called Through the Gaps Between My Teeth. This is a generative real-time animation. Here, alphabetical characters swarm around the projected image, occasionally come together to form words and sentences, oscillating between the transcript of President Trump's Access Hollywood tape and the first-person accounts of sexual assault publicly posted on Twitter between October and December 2016, just the 2-3 months period that I archived through a custom script. There is a deliberate structural limitation to this custom software, is the fact that every Twitter message has to be reconstructed using only the letters used by these particular Trump quote, which leaves imperfections in the text, kind of alluding to the structural limitations involved in speaking out about such subject matter. The next piece is a 44-minute video, single-channel video piece called Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Brett. And this piece appropriates the entire footage of Justice Brett Kavanaugh's opening statement addressing sexual assault allegations against him during his Supreme Court confirmation hearings in 2018. A custom script replaces his spoken words with this kind of very colorful text slides. Also, it kind of switches out his voice with this kind of elevator music. So the text slides are kind of punctuated by the moments of silence. So he's only visible when he's silent, kind of drinking or catches his breath, composes himself, very emotional. The work both silences his voice while simultaneously magnifying his entitlement, privilege, and power. These are two documents that became very important to me for this next ongoing project I want to share with you, and which was part of the show that Katherine organized. Justice Kavanaugh suggests, so on the left, this is part of his dissent when he was in DC Circuit Judge, dissent in Garza versus Hargan from 2017, which involved the government's efforts to block a 17-year-old migrant in its custody from getting an abortion. This teenager, who was detained at a private shelter in Texas, had already obtained a judicial bypass, meaning that she could access care without a parent or guardian's permission. But the government agency refused to allow her to go to a clinic, and then instead they forced her into counseling at a crisis pregnancy center. So ACLU sued on behalf and won in the DC Circuit Court, prompting his dissent. So here he suggests that the government should have more time to find a teenager, an immigrant sponsor. But what struck me is his phrasing of this. He kind of says that, this decision creates a new right for unlawful immigrant minors. As if he's drawing the line, between whose rights are protected here and whose rights are not, based on the immigration status. The right is the Public Law 94-439, also known as the Departments of Labor and Health, Education, Welfare Appropriation Act of 1977. This was passed in September 1976. This law included several provisions, including the amendment called the Hyde Amendment. This amendment still exists today, which prohibits federal Medicaid payments for abortions, except in cases of rape, incest, or when the mother's life is in danger. Again, this line gets drawn, who gets to have what rights, based on how much money you make. So Warp and Weft is a series kind of born out of these two documents. In this series, I shred two different types of legal documents and then weave them together into a tapestry, almost creating a material testament of systemic injustices. So in this particular one, this is the first one I made, and then in this one, I uses the ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement spreadsheet that was tracking undocumented minors' pregnancy. And then for the weft, which is the horizontal threads, is the Hyde Amendment and also the Justice Kavanaugh's dissenting opinion. The second one, I kind of expand those two kind of anti-immigrant sentiments and anti-abortion legislation that was kind of happening around the same time. This is some detail. Accompanying the tapestry is a photographic series in which I activate this tapestry. I sleep, meditate, use the toilet, kind of to show that this is actual kind of fabric that you can kind of wear, and it's not this kind of fragile thing that you need to kind of decorate, your apartment with. It also brings the body directly in touch with the text itself, and then it kind of make this kind of direct relationship that our body has with the text completely visible. The third one uses Shelby County versus Holder, the very important Voting Rights Act case. And it kind of crisscrossed with Arizona, Alabama, Georgia, Texas state codes on abortion. And they happen to be part of those pre-clearance states that are the Voting Rights Act Section 5 states. There's some details. One of the photographic series using the tapestry. This particular one uses the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families of 1996, kind of regarding crime and also welfare reform with 10 different states nearly activated abortion ban just in 2022, after the Dobbs decision has passed. This is a family portrait that I am using this same tapestry as like a photo shoot backdrop. And in it, I am reading a book from 2019 by Sophie Lewis called Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, in which she paints what a full reproductive justice might look like, free from techno-capitalist machinery. It owes in large part to many Black and Indigenous feminist thinkers and activists arguing for the society where the form of mothering and care detached from, you don't just care for your own baby, you have to care for everyone's baby, and your baby should be cared by other people too, not only someone who can pay for it. The last piece I want to share is this very short 1 minute, 30-second video that I'm not going to play. It's just like little screenshots that I put them together. It's a single-channel video featuring AI-generated footage of Chief Justice John Roberts. In it, he seems to argue and joke, saying, "Staying in cyber life is going to kill you. Come out for coffee, you have my number." This is the statement that a cyber stalker in Colorado used to threaten a musician. Okay? And here, he seems to say that this statement cannot be truly threatening in any context. So this work is based on the audio recording of the actual oral argument session of Counterman versus Colorado, during which John Roberts actually said these words, mocking and patronizing a victim of years-long stalking. Given that the Supreme Court of the United States does not allow cameras in the courtroom, no video footage of John Roberts actually saying this exists. So I used the AI to make him say these words. The use of AI attaches the body to the speech while problematizing the First Amendment as a tool for patriarchal violence, especially considering the fact that a similar deepfake technology is right now being used to target women, and it's still protected under the guise of First Amendment. Where the First Amendment rights of men seem sacrosanct, even if it involves silencing and suppressing the First Amendment of rights of women, the musician had to stop performing because of this harassment. I just wanted to quickly share some work in progress. This is just new work that I'm working on, and also just share a little bit of process, how I make these weavings. So I cut the documents literally by hand, and then I glue them by hand, and then I use this loom to create the actual hand weave these. This is one of the new work that I'm working on, which is I'm going to create this kind of curtain. This is the first panel. Another work in progress is that, I don't know, you can see these like really lovely table skirts. We also have something similar here too. You know, in the conference, we tend to have a lot of tablecloth covering things up. The right side is actually a picture of actual work session of the City Council of Texas in Amarillo City, and because they're working on like if they want to put up on this ordinance to become a sanctuary cities for the unborn, effectively barring access to abortion at the local level. So in Texas, you're like, but it's already all banned. Like, why do you need this work session? So in Texas, the ordinance was slightly different. They were actually trying to create a trafficking law so that you cannot actually drive anyone outside the state through Amarillo who are getting an abortion. So I'm quite interested in what happens in this public comment section. You know, before the vote, people come out, say for or against, and you know, people do talk about a lot of things. And I am kind of interested in what's happening sort of in democracy behind the scene. It's not really behind, you can find these online, but probably not many people actually look at them. So I'm creating these tablecloth with embroidered LEDs that can work as a display sign that can scroll these kind of conversations happening in real time. Thank you so much, and now I'm going to hand off to Steve.
Well, happy Constitution Day to everyone. It's great to be here with Katherine and Bang Geul and with all of you, including some former students in the audience, on this wonderful day for this wonderful discussion. There's my title. Forgot to flip the slide. So I don't have as many slides for you or as many beautiful images, but I have some ways of talking about them that might help us think about the nature of what the constitutional project is and the role of ordinary people in that process. So I think picturing the Constitution was a particularly apt title for this show because it's useful, I think, to think about the Constitution as a picture or as a series of pictures. And we have here a ChatGPT-generated image of a palimpsest. So what is a palimpsest? Some of you may know. It's an ancient document, a piece of parchment, that's comprised of layers of writing over generations, with some layers that are effaced, that are rubbed out, either physically or chemically, to make room for new passages. And the reason for palimpsests was paper wasn't available in the ancient world. If you had a piece of parchment, you weren't going to just let it be. It's very expensive and difficult to find new parchments, so you make use of old ones. So palimpsests look something like this ChatGPT-generated image, where you strip certain layers off, you add new writing, but there's always traces of the old lingering. The brushstrokes of each generation add to the portrait. It's sort of an architectural document. So I'd like to talk about 3 constitutional moments These are all moments of picturing the Constitution and how they relate to some of the pieces that we just were introduced to. I'm thinking about the pieces that lean into the principle of we the people, and especially of some of the pieces that relate to the erasure of abortion rights from the Constitution, from that parchment that came with the Dobbs versus Jackson decision of 2022. So the three pieces that inspired me to think about this are Bang Geul's Sam's Kitchen Towels, which you just heard more about. The As My Rights Are Washed Away bloomers in the middle by Winnie van der Rijn, which transform men's boxer shorts into a uterine gird. And penumbra, another P word that we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a moment, which harkens back to the Griswold decision of 1965, and that was the foundation for Roe versus Wade 8 years later. Now, each of these pieces, and I think many of the other pieces that Katherine walked us through, and Bang Geul's pieces that are in progress, can be seen as a kind of resistance to a perceived abuse of power. But I think they're more than that. They're more profound than that. They fit comfortably into a tradition in American law and politics that some scholars call popular constitutionalism. The idea that at the end of the day, despite what it appears to be, it is the people who are in charge. The Constitution is in our hands. So first to the constitutional moments, and then we'll talk more about what popular constitutionalism is. First, we have the moment of creation. We're celebrating today 237 years since the Constitution was signed in 1787. That's the original moment. You can also add to it 1789, when the document was ratified, and 1791, when the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. In this moment of creation, this initial picturing, the founders, the framers, were painting on a blank canvas to create the world's first and now oldest Constitution. The Constitution was inspired conceptually by a few sources: the Declaration of Rights and the idea of the rule of law in the Magna Carta from the 13th century, notions of limited government and the separation of powers that came from John Locke and from Montesquieu. But these were only inspiration. They were not models. There was no model for the American Constitution. It was the first attempt to constitute a democratic republic via parchment and to lay out the structure of the government and the rights of citizens. So that's moment number one. The numbering, we have 3 moments number one, it seems. The second moment is a moment of creation through interpretation. The Constitution was the first of its kind, which means it's the oldest, but it's also, as Katherine mentioned, one of the world's shortest and most Delphic constitutions. It's about 4,400 words unamended, 7,500 words with all 27 amendments. That's a New Yorker article. It's not a lot of words to capture and define such a big, complex nation. Most constitutions are in the tens of thousands of words. India's, I think, is the world's longest at 150,000 words. And it doesn't help in the case of the American Constitution that so many of the words are so broad and undefined. Among the majestic generalities are, in the 8th Amendment, the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The 4th Amendment bans unreasonable searches and seizures. In the 5th and 14th Amendments, you have a clause saying that one's life, liberty, and property cannot be taken away without due process of law. Lovely language, but how do you apply that? As a judge, what content do you give to those words? Maybe the judges need to gaze at the words, at a corner of the picture of the Constitution and repicture it or read between the lines, re-envision it, give it life. Every act of interpretation is an act of creation or recreation. which of course is problematic because judges, we know from Montesquieu, we know from civics in elementary school, judges are not supposed to make the law. They're supposed to interpret it and apply it as handed to them. So this tension is at the heart of so many debates about what the Constitution means. So let's take an example drawn straight from the work Penumbra from the show, and that is Griswold versus Connecticut, 1965. A law in Connecticut bans the sale and use of contraceptives. It's challenged as unconstitutional. So it gets to the Supreme Court. What does the Supreme Court say? They say, yes, there is a right to use contraceptives, and it's found in the constitutional right to privacy. Wonderful. But if you look at the Constitution, you will not find any explicit mention, not just of birth control or of contraceptives, you will not find the word privacy. The words are not there. So how did the Supreme Court find the right? Through various means. The majority, 4 justices, said the concept is there hiding in other words. These are the so-called penumbras, those partially shaded regions. So penumbras specifically, Justice Douglas wrote, from the First, the Third, the Fourth, the Fifth, and the Ninth Amendments. It's an implicit, abstract concept in the Bill of Rights, even if we don't have any word saying there's a right to privacy. So as I said, 4 of the 9 justices liked that characterization, but there were 3 other justices who didn't like that story or that theory, but they found the right to privacy elsewhere. Justice Goldberg said, all you need is the 9th Amendment, the shortest amendment, the one that says there are rights other than the ones that the Constitution lists. And privacy must be one of those. Justices Harlan and White didn't like the 9th Amendment, they didn't like the penumbras. They said, let's just turn to the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Liberty is our catch-all, which includes privacy. And then there were 2 dissenters, Justices Stewart and Black, who said, I like privacy. Privacy is wonderful, but I read the Constitution, I looked at it very carefully, I looked at all corners, and it's not there, so we can't protect it. But the majority says there was a right to privacy, so 8 years later, abortion comes to the court. And in Roe versus Wade, the majority uses Griswold as a foundation to confirm that, yes, there is a right to privacy in the Constitution, and it is, quote, broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. All right, so that's 2 constitutional moments. The creation, the first picturing of these words, and the second picturing, the embellishment of Griswold and Roe 180 years later, which brings us to 2022 and the Dobbs decision. After the picture of the Constitution had been embellished by the court 50 years prior, those new brushstrokes were added of privacy, sort of a broad one for privacy, and then finer strokes for abortion rights. A new majority looks back and says, that was not a faithful embellishment. That altered the Constitution. That defiled the Constitution. That is a picture of the Constitution that is fundamentally incompatible with the original picture of the Constitution. The Roe majority were not good lawyers, they were not good judges, they were renegade graffiti artists. So Justice Sam Alito, Justice Thomas, and the 3 justices appointed by Donald Trump got out their paint stripper, and in a flash, they peeled off 5 decades layers of paint on the Constitution, scrubbing that corner of the picture of the Constitution clean and restoring it to its pre-1973 state. But it's not quite that simple, because in doing all that scrubbing, the court did not want to erase other fundamental rights that are protected through similar reasoning. So Justice Alito insisted in his majority opinion that other so-called substantive due process rights, contraception, marriage, the right to raise your children as you choose, the right to send your kids to private school, the right to sexual intimacy, all of these are rights and they're safe, and we're not taking those away. We're not applying paint stripper to those embellishments of the picture. but why not? This is conceptually the most troubling aspect of the Dobbs decision. There might be other troubling parts, but conceptually and jurisprudentially, Alito really has no good argument here. If there are lists of fundamental rights that are not enumerated in the text of the Constitution, why are some still part of the picture and others not part of the picture? Justice Thomas is actually the only member of the majority to call into question all those other substantive due process rights and say, let's reconsider marriage, contraception, all these other things. But he was the only one to say that. Well, the reaction to Dobbs, I think it's safe to say, has been fierce. Justice Alito wrote in that opinion a line which is becoming more famous, which is this one: women are not without electoral or political power. So they can go to their state legislatures and advocate in their individual states for what they want. And sure enough, ballot measures, even in red states like Kansas, Kentucky, and Ohio, have gone the pro-choice way. And 2 months from now, 10 more states have abortion referenda on the ballot. So we'll see if this trend continues. But what I think is clear is that people are mobilizing to put forward and do a different view of abortion rights from that of the Supreme Court majority, and they're having at least some success. And those three pieces in Katherine's show in Picturing the Constitution, I think are very much part of that movement. They are not simply protesting. They're not screaming into a void. They're part of a rich American tradition in which interpreting the Constitution, picturing it, repicturing it, is not just in the hands of judges, it's in the hands of the people. And one more quick word on that, and a little footnote, and maybe a book recommendation for you. Larry Kramer is a legal scholar. He taught at NYU Law for many years and then was the dean of Stanford Law School. He's been in and out of academia since then, but he wrote a book 20 years ago called The People Themselves, Popular Constitutionalism and Judicial Review. And it developed the idea that we've all been talking about. And I think the message is a perfect match for this show, maybe a theoretical underpinning. He argues that constitutional interpretation is a democratic process involving broad engagement, not just from judges, but from people in other branches of government, other levels of government, national, state, local, and most of all from regular people, ordinary citizens. And I won't read the whole quote, but just a couple lines from it. He writes, "This modern understanding," and the modern understanding he's referring to is the idea that constitutional law should be the preserve of a trained elite of lawyers and judges, that it's not in the people's hands. He says that elitist, lawyer-only notion is of surprisingly recent vintage. It reflects neither the original conception of constitutionalism nor its course over most of American history. Both in its origins and for most of our history, American constitutionalism assigned ordinary citizens a central and pivotal role in implementing their constitution. Final interpretive authority rested with the people themselves, and courts, no less than elected representatives, were subordinate to their judgments. So how's that for a message for Constitution Day? Yes, the Supreme Court has a lot of power over us. We should care about who sits on it, what they do, who they take money and gifts from. Yes, not to say ignore the institution, but ultimately the Constitution is in we the people's hands, in the hands of citizens, students, teachers, artists, all of us. Thank you.
It is now time for the question and answer session. I apologize.
So I think we're going to do a little bit of discussion between the three of us, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and feel free to remind me when the time has come for that, if we're going over. But first of all, thank you too for such informative and really inspiring presentations. I think they really tied into the theme of picturing the Constitution. And one thing that really struck me in both of your presentations was kind of the idea of the Constitution really not only having a great, and these kind of Supreme Court decisions having a huge impact on people's everyday lives, and kind of the importance of recognizing, the connection between these kind of abstract texts and, the body, as you show in your work, Bang Geul. And then so not only that, but the importance of people engaging with the Constitution and really, as you just mentioned, kind of taking it into your own hands. So I guess maybe both of you can talk a little bit about kind of how you hope to maybe people will respond to your work. How do you hope to kind of impact people? How do you know that you're successful in doing that? Steven, maybe you can talk a little bit about your work, either working with students to teach them about the Constitution and interesting and get them excited about it, or your work as a journalist writing about these issues as well.
Sure. Yeah, so I have two hats. I write about the Supreme Court for The Economist and for other places, and I teach a lot of things, but also Supreme Court-related issues and constitutional cases. And I try to inspire and give people the tools to understand what's happening. Sometimes it's a process of translation. If there is a complicated legal case that needs to be put in simpler terms, and that applies both, as a journalist and as a teacher, to make it clear, what the issues are. Sometimes they're very clear, sometimes and easy to characterize, and sometimes it takes some work to turn it into a story that readers or students can grasp. But I see that as sort of the role that links the two positions together, of just trying to take something which is maybe inaccessible on some level and turn it into something that's in everyone's hands, so they can react and critique and make change.
Yeah, like someone like me, who has no law background, rely on someone like Steve, literally, journalist. But I guess for me, it's empowering when people come into my studio and then look at the work and then say, where do you get these documents? And I'm like, these are all public documents. You can go look at them. You can read them. It's not some secret documents that only lawyers can access. And people are like, oh, that exchange itself to me is quite, I guess, rewarding. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do both of you have any influences on your work? I guess have other artists influenced you? Do you want to speak to any other kind of media besides the work in the show that you feel like is doing a particularly successful job explaining the Constitution or engaging people in it?
There are a lot of wonderful journalists writing, and also podcasts. There are great Supreme Court podcasts for those of you who are interested. Strict Scrutiny is one of the best, and Amicus. Yeah. And there are more. It's just there are many ways of accessing information and informed opinion about the court today than there were 10 years ago. And one thing that I really like about Bang Geul's piece involving Chief Justice Roberts and the Counter versus Colorado case is, we don't get to see justices in the courtroom unless you go there personally to witness it. And that's something that I prioritize for my students. So I've been lucky to bring groups of students to the Supreme Court to go to oral arguments and meet with clerks and see, how this actually happens. And they get insights that you can't get from just reading transcripts or even from listening to the oral arguments as they're live streamed. But I do encourage everyone, and when I'm covering a case on Twitter, when I'm not in the courtroom, but I'm listening, I always put a link out there and remind people, you can listen to this. And it's not quite the same as seeing them saying it, but there are opportunities and access points for seeing how this is done, and, well, listening or seeing how this is done and how the court is addressing these hugely important cases involving all of our lives.
And do you ever use any sort of, artistic or creative, I guess, assignments or other kind of things in the classroom?
I'm incredibly boring, and I need to do more of that. This is going to be an inspirational, project for me, and I hope I can bring more of it into my teaching. The only cases that I can recall in teaching students about the Supreme Court where I've brought images in have been cases where images are central to the dispute. One is the Andy Warhol case from just last year. Some of you might have heard about, where Andy Warhol made some silk screens based on photographs of the artist Prince. And the question was whether he had violated the copyright protections of that photographer. And really the only way to understand that case is by looking at the photograph Lynn Goldsmith took of Prince and the silk screens that Andy Warhol generated from them or using them, and to determine, is this a transformative piece of art or is it just a copy? Did he just steal this from her? That's a fascinating case. Andy Warhol, his foundation, his estate, lost that case, to the great consternation of Justice Kagan and Chief Justice Roberts, who were the only two dissenters, and said, these other 7 justices are Philistines. They don't know Andy Warhol. They don't know the great contributions and transformative nature of his work. So that was one. And just very briefly, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case from 2018 involving the Christian baker who didn't want to make a cake for a same-sex wedding. There was the most incredible amicus brief I've ever seen in that case, where wedding cake bakers, hired lawyers to display their wondrous cakes that they've created as a way of showing that this is not just baking, it's not just flour and icing. This is art, and it must be protected under the First Amendment. So there are some cases that lend themselves to images pretty clearly, but
interesting. Yeah, I would love to see those cakes. I'm gonna have to look them up now. What about you, Bang Geul, in terms of influences or things you would recommend?
Yeah, too many. But I think early influence definitely someone like Sophie Calle, who uses text very personal, but really blurs boundary between how text can be very private and then open up into a public space. Others like Mona Hatoum is also very important to me, or Valley Export, kind of using their body as almost like a public space to explore. And someone like Tony Coates or Glenn Ligon, another 2 great artists who use text a lot in their work. Again, someone that I follow and very much respect and look up to. Yeah,
makes sense. And in your work, I guess, is it important that people can read snippets of the text? I noticed that some of them are, highlighted or more kind of larger or more visible than others.
Yes, in some way. That's why I don't just shred them and using Shredder. I actually cut them all by hand so that those texts are actually somewhat intact. And, how important is it that people read them? It's up to them. Everything is up to the viewer, really. But at the same time, I want to give them an option, so that's an option if you want to read them.
And I think that's what unites a lot of the work in the show, that you can kind of choose to appreciate it from afar because it's visually striking or whatever, but then hopefully you'll go up and you'll take a closer look at some of the actual texts or some of the kind of, things that make these patriotic symbols in the work a little bit, unusual or raising questions in them. So I think that's great. I guess we might have time for one or two more questions. Obviously we're in an election year in less than 2 months. It's hard to ignore that. Does either of you want to speak to kind of things that are on your mind leading up to the election, whether it's more recent Supreme Court decisions or specific topics you're working with?
Is there an election coming up? I'm paying attention to the obvious things, but also the Senate, because which party controls the Senate, depending on who's in the White House, will determine if judges are seated in the next 4 years or not. If there is a Republican Senate and a Democratic president, or vice versa, there won't be any justices changing hands in the next 4 years, and it'll be more and more difficult to get lower court judges seated. It's just become so much more polarized and difficult, and Republicans have shown that they are not interested in bending when it comes to appointments, and I would expect that Democrats, if the tables returned, will have a very similar approach. So that's one thing I'm watching.
I'm all about these days local election, like education board, school board elections, library board elections, all those like small elections where, the votes are the election is decided by like very, very few votes, and those all matter. So, yeah.
That's good. And, I think a lot of the artists selected for the show were also kind of finding ways for people to participate on sort of a local level as well. Whether writing postcards to your representatives or meeting in groups to discuss how to protest or something like that. Do we have time for one final question? Then we'll open it up to the audience. Okay. I think also one thing I was thinking about is, obviously the work in the show is very, I think, inspiring in a lot of ways and raises questions, but obviously it's really hard to actually amend the Constitution. And I guess, what do you guys think is the value of engaging artists in this kind of process when the actual changing the Constitution or changing the Supreme Court or any of some of these laws is so hard to do? And maybe, Steve, you can talk a little bit about like why that process has become so difficult in recent years.
Well, we can't just throw up our hands, right? I mean, there aren't going to be any amendments passed and ratified anytime soon. As you all probably know, it takes both houses of Congress, supermajorities in both, and then a supermajority of the states to get an amendment through. And so you might ask, why did Biden, after the Trump immunity decision, why did he say, we need a constitutional amendment to reverse that decision? Well, I don't think he's under any illusion that it's going to be easy or even plausible to pass such a thing. But to get the conversation going, I think it's a good idea to raise the possibility of a constitutional amendment. It shows where people's values are. It shows what people think needs to be done based on what's been happening at the court and elsewhere. And it's the same with all these works of art, right? Without imagination, we have no opportunity to make changes in the near or long term. We can't just say, we can't just close up shop and say, all right, that is the way it is, they're in control. I might as well just watch Netflix.
We need to have a concept of a plan.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Exactly, yes.
Can't top that as a closing line. So maybe I should open it up to the audience now for questions.
Depending on how hard the questions are, that might be our go-to answer.
Okay, it's now actually time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to come to you. We reserve the first question for students, and then we will open up to the greater audience. We will now take the first question.
Hello, my name is Lily Kell, and I am a student here at Dickinson. This question is for Steve, but I would love to hear the other panelists' opinion. How do you feel about the overwhelmingly popular idea of term limits and reform within the Supreme Court, and the idea that there needs to be more checks and balances within the Supreme Court system?
I am all for term limits personally. There is no other high court in the world where justices serve for life. It seems like a bad idea to have people serving for 30, 40 years. It would be wonderful if they would have shorter terms. Now, how do we do that? There have been some proposals to pass a constitutional amendment, which is a good way to, and a secure way to do it, but as I've just said, it's not going to happen. So a more realistic way of doing it is to get Congress to pass a law. And one of the proposals is to have 18-year terms where every president gets 2 appointments, and to get around the constitutional problem in Article 3 that says that justices, actually all federal judges, serve a life term or on good behavior. Justices would be rotated off the Supreme Court to serve as senior justices, where they would be affiliated maybe with a circuit court, but they wouldn't be actively deciding on Supreme Court cases. I think it's a really interesting and good idea. The only, well, there may be more than one problem, but the biggest problem is it will be challenged as unconstitutional. And who are the people who are going to decide if it's constitutional? Yeah. Well, I'll note one more problem, which is even if it's found to be constitutional by the Supreme Court, the proposals on offer only kick in for future appointees. So all 9 who are on now would not be term limited because the terms on which they took their gavel, well, no one actually has a gavel on the Supreme Court, but their metaphorical gavel means that they serve as long as they wish. So it would be a very slow burn implementation process, and maybe by 2100 we'd have 9 justices who have 18-year terms.
Hi, first of all, thank you guys for coming today. So my question is, in one of my classes, we've been talking a little bit about, it's actually like a women and gender and politics class, and we talked about the past few days the Equal Rights Amendment, and I just wanted to know, like, for Steve, like, what are your thoughts on that? And then for the artists on the panel, have you ever met like an artist or seen works on that like amendment or anything having to do with that? And what do those look like?
Well, I'll answer that because I have sort of an easy answer in that one of those cyanotype prints in the show was actually somebody who wrote in one of Maya, the artist's workshops, that she wanted to see the Equal Rights Amendment added to the Constitution. So I think people are aware of it, or maybe they talked about it in kind of the small group discussion in one of her events and performances, and are definitely kind of proposing it as the 28th Amendment. You want to speak more on that, or why it's so difficult to
pass?
Yeah.
I mean, it got very close, but the ERA didn't quite make it, and it could be rejuvenated. And, just to bring back that image which Katherine passed over too quickly of her daughter's proposed amendment. Right? I mean, that is so powerful. Imagine you're a child and you're given a pen, and you can come up with a change to the Constitution you would like to see. You can dismiss it as just kids saying what they want, but that sets the stage for a citizen, a few years from now, who is going to feel empowered to make changes on, if not the national constitutional amendment level, then locally or in her state or wherever. But just to have that mindset, I think, is the right thing.
I think, to be fair, she didn't completely come up with that on her own, because I think I think I just sort of talked through the project with her a little bit. I was like, "Oh, what would you like to see?" Otherwise, she might have written like, I want free ice cream, or who knows.
That
Yeah, I
might
think
be an
that's a great
amendment that
point.
could be ratified, free ice cream for all.
I think going into this 2024 election, a lot of voters are feeling this impending sense of doom, like we're being forced to vote between the lesser of two evils. And you talk about in this discussion how the Constitution it seems like it's a very permanent document. It's very hard to amend. It's very hard to make changes to. I guess, what is your advice, like going into this 2024 election, and how are we supposed to keep our spirits high when it feels like there's not a lot that we can do as voters?
It's a tough question. I mean, I think that voting is important no matter what, because I think if you don't make your voice heard, then, I don't know. But I think what the show is trying to tell us is the importance of continuing to stay engaged, because I think without voting and without kind of getting involved, and as Bang Geul suggested, one way is maybe to get involved on a more local level and see if there's a institution or government in your community where you can make a change, or maybe petitioning for, or trying to get a local candidate elected by canvassing or making phone calls that you care about. So that's kind of one way to do it, is focusing more on the local level. I've done some activism myself around very local issues that matter to me, like universal preschool for my kids in my neighborhood, and that kind of makes me feel like I have a little bit more power maybe than on the national level. But I think no matter what, voting in the presidential election is important, because if you don't kind of stand up and fight for the rights that you do have, you risk more rights being taken away, I guess would be my answer. And some of the works in the show definitely kind of represent that concept in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's really good point. Like, don't go into that side of apathy, like keep engaging. And like local election is a great example that, you feel like you have no power, but actually, these elections get decided by like 2 votes, and you do have power, and who gets into those seats. But also in terms of like, how to choose between lesser evil kind of question is like, I think it's really the question. I think I saw this on Instagram. It's not about between 2 evils. It's like, which candidate can I actually will make it more easy for me to mobilize,
I was going to say that too.
It's like, which candidate will suppress my voice, or which candidate, I might be having an easier time to go out and protest. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say the same thing.
That's all wonderful. I would just repeat the wise words of Justice Samuel Alito. Women are not without electoral and political power. I think he meant that as kind of a throwaway line, and he probably didn't realize or have any concept of what was coming in terms of mobilization throughout the country of people who were resisting actively and finding ways to protect abortion rights in their own states.
Hi, my name is Renee Kramer. Thank you. This is awesome. I really appreciate the juxtaposition of popular constitutionalism and the creative moment of art, right? And I'm almost there, but the Alito quote and the representation of the court from the 2 different perspectives related to ideological stance of the president and the Senate who confirmed, both of them are leading me to a question around whether, Professor Mazie perhaps, whether we want to articulate a stance where rights are the purview of the majority to grant, whether or not the person who doesn't have the right has the political power in a given locality to safeguard her rights.
I mean, I was trying to come with a sunny message on Constitution Day, but No, but, I mean, I'm thinking about Bang Geul's piece, interweaving Dobbs with the Brnovich decision, and I think that wasn't a random selection of those two cases, right? They're both written by Sam Alito. One takes away abortion rights, the other waters down voting rights. And that's sort of the spirit of your question, I think, that the system, as it stands, is not very democratic. The Senate, I was talking about earlier, is a profoundly anti-democratic institution, where every state, from Montana to New York, has the same representation. There are many limitations on our ability to make our voices heard, but there are still opportunities to develop one's voice and to develop one's reasoning and knowledge to be an informed and a good citizen. And I think there's still plenty of room for popular constitutionalism, people thinking about their rights, and I think it's okay for majorities to advocate for constitutional rights. We have this kind of inherited Warren Court, I think, position that the Constitution is designed to protect minorities from majorities. And it is in part, but the majority can also advocate for itself and for minorities at the same time. So I think there's plenty of reason to be worried about and pursue reform structurally of many aspects of the American political system. But within the kind of somewhat crappy reality that we have because of various institutions not representing us fully, there's still plenty of opportunities.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to that, but I like how you referenced those particular pieces in the show, and I thought that was a really interesting project. They were also like color coded in terms of which party they belong to, so you can kind of see the height difference in that as well. It's interesting.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, thank you for coming. This is amazing. My question is primarily for Bang Geul, but everyone else, I'm curious. What do you all think about the role of art and creative thinking and protest in civics education in this country in particular right now, probably for youth?
You mean what is the role of the art? What can it be? What can it do? I think it can definitely open up some channels of thinking and make connections between things that you don't really think about making connections with, which is, I think, really important, like a lateral thinking, not you're just like thinking about just one thing and everything is compartmentalized and not connected. Art is a really great way of connecting different things and how lives are connected. And that's essentially what civic is, like how we relate to others and how we live together with others. And some sense that art can really create that almost like a exercise, an activity and also a place, safe space that can happen. Sorry, it's very abstract. I'm going to stay there. So, Katherine.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Steve was sort of pointing out, I think artists do have a role to play that might be different from politicians or lawyers or justices in terms of just coming up, using their imagination and kind of bringing ideas out there that maybe other types of professionals can't really do in their field or, wouldn't venture to put out there. So I think that's one thing. And then maybe those ideas can actually inspire the people who are in power or have the ability to actually enact some of these changes. And I also feel like there's just such an important role of the visual culture from protests. Like there are so many different examples of signs and kind of iconic images that artists have designed. I mean, I'm even just thinking of that Shepherd Ferry image from the 2008 election cycle that became such an important part of like the messaging. And I think now more recently, like even the kind of memes on social media are becoming so important in, you know, this current election and some of the messaging that's out there. And, you know, artists today kind of appropriating historic protest signs. You see that a lot, like in the work I showed by Dred Scott, like the I Am a Man poster became this, you know, very iconic symbol as well of struggles that were in the past but are still persisting today. So I think kind of recycling these images almost and repurposing them through generations can be a really powerful way of messaging and kind of bringing the past into the present and these ongoing struggles. And then just, you know, I feel like protests almost wouldn't be as powerful at all without the images, and, you know, they also attract so much media coverage and make it easier to kind of cover these protests and for people to get excited about them. So I just think it can play such a big role, and I do hope that sort of history is being taught in classes that are about politics as well as art history, I guess I would say. Yeah, well, if no one has any other questions, I mean, I guess it's almost 8:30. I do have like a 2-minute video clip about the Handwriting the Constitution project that we could end with if folks want to watch a short video, which might be kind of a really inspiring way to end things and kind of a positive note to end things on. I hope if folks want to stay, if you need to head out, you know, I can just play this if you think we have time. Hopefully I can figure out how to get to the video file. Here. So this is a clip from the documentary that I mentioned before with Morgan O'Hara about handwriting the Constitution, just people